little bit as well. So video is your choice, but please keep yourself muted. Dan and Tara, thanks for being here.
Thanks. Well, I will get us started. First of all, I am so grateful to be here. It was a very generous introduction, and I am just so beyond pleased to have this opportunity. Davidson is a very special place, as we all know, and I was in 7th grade when I first met my classmates and friends from Davidson. I lived in Huntersville at the time, as Ada said, but we all went to J.M. Alexander Middle School. So you can imagine that's up in North Huntersville, South Huntersville. I'm not really that good with directions. English teacher was my expertise. But anyway, it was a long way away from Davidson, but we all went to the same school. That's how different things were back then. But the students that I met from Davidson were generous and thoughtful, and they were bold and they were different. They stood out. They were also very much a part of the dominant caste. As we know, that's still very much the case. So while Davidson is a special place and has a special place in my heart, and I am proud to be a citizen of Davidson, I think that one of the reasons that we're here today is to talk about not only being special, but also being more diverse, more equitable, and being more inclusive. So thanks for starting this journey with us. You might be just starting. These might be your first steps, or you might have been on this journey for a long time. But one thing that I know for sure is that if we go together, we will go far. So thanks for being here. I want you to know that you belong here. You belong in this conversation. You belong in this moment. You belong in this movement. And none of us are going to get the words right. I will not get any of the words right. You will see that. It'll be very clear as we go. But with a good heart, an open heart, and good intentions, we will make the best of a very imperfect inheritance that we have, and we will make a difference. So thank you for being here. You do belong. Thanks for showing up. We do have a few norms that we'll talk about. One of the ones that's most important to me is that you might be feeling fearful right now, or uncomfortable, or nervous. I'm very nervous. But don't let that fear keep you from fully engaging, from being present, and from being courageous. So I don't like the concept of being fearless. I don't know hardly anyone that's fearless, but I know a whole lot of people who are courageous. And so when they have fear, when they are nervous, they show up anyway and they do their best. So let's start there. Be respectful, intentional, kind, open-minded, open-hearted, courageous. Make space for all the voices. Assume good intention, get the benefit of the doubt. Get comfortable with being uncomfortable. That's the feeling of growth, and it's the discomfort of change. Embrace this conversation as the beginning, as the opening and widening of a gate, not the closing of one. So unfortunately, at the end of this hour-ish together, we are not going to have a silver bullet. We're not going to have all the answers. You'll probably have more questions than you started with, but you will have planted seeds. You will have opened your heart a little bit more. So this is just the beginning, the opening, and the widening of that gate. Be easier with yourself, be easy with me, be easy with each other, and let's get going. So tonight is about setting context. It's about our history. It's about coming to terms with our history, about knowing our history, agreeing on what our history is. And in Ms. Wilkerson's terms, it's about our country's caste system as part of our history. We want to set the context and come to some understanding of the history so that we can talk about localizing this conversation in our beautiful, precious town, and also what the future looks like and how we participate in that. So, Mr. Dan, thank you for being here. Your expertise is so needed on this topic. I'd like to open with a question for you about your thoughts on this concept of understanding our past, coming to terms with it, knowing what the truth is, when so many people would rather us just move forward and say the past is in the past. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, the present is a product of all that happened in the past, and our positions in life, much about our society, much about our own selves, was produced by people in the past whom we don't know necessarily, about things that happened in the past that we may not know about, that aren't directly related to us, had a profound effect on us. So you can't understand, in our text, the history, say, of race, we're talking about in Caste, without understanding things about just slavery, Jim Crow society. The thing that she talks about in Caste also is upper casteness, the notion that whiteness is a very privileged and prized status that people aspire to acquire. Yeah? And that the race problem, in essence, the mayor, if you want to flip it around and look at it differently, is that whiteness is so heavily valued. Yeah? And that unwhiteness is seen as sort of inferior and less deserving, and that the extent that people will go to preserve and protect the concept of whiteness. Whites have a great degree of intermarriage. Whites cluster together when they live in largely white areas. Whites largely socialize with each other. So I would say a large part of the race problem is about sort of not abolishing the idea of European descent, or you need to denigrate your European heritage. You shouldn't be proud of being European, but the idea that it's a valued commodity that must be preserved, and its loss will be a catastrophe for you. I think so. Many of the ideas about race, about how the conditions of different groups of people in society came from the past. So you can't just sort of erase the past and say, well, from now on, we'll just proceed as if nothing ever happened over the last 400 years. People are profoundly affected by past injustices.
Thank you.
You can't understand people without understanding what happened in the past.
And that's part of what this book does. And I'm so grateful for what Ms. Wilkerson writes about and helping me understand more about our past. And I'm certain that others on our Zoom call feel the same way. So thank you for that. What about the caste system, as Ms. Wilkerson describes it, resonate with you? Are there parts that don't resonate with you?
Well, let me give you my take on it. On the one hand, what you find is that she doesn't claim, rightly, I mean, she does not claim that she's the first person to draw an analogy between, since we're talking about the black-white dichotomy, Jim Crow racism, and the Indian caste system. What you find if you do research in among African-American intellectuals, or you read African-American newspapers from the 20s and 30s, that they were greatly interested in the Indian independence movement of the 1920s and 30s. People like Gandhi and Nehru in the Indian National Congress got heavy coverage in Black newspapers. They were deeply sympathized with. But Black people's interpretation of that went in two ways. One was the idea, we're a caste, much like that caste system in India, it's analogous to us. But also, Black Americans viewed Gandhi and Nehru as anti-colonial revolutionaries. So at the same time, Black people view their condition here as being like caste. They also view themselves as a people, as a distinct people, a national group like the Scots or something, who are in a colonial situation. And you'll find that both of those sort of concepts of self coexist in African Americans at the same time. They're somewhat contradictory, but much of our identity is harmonizing contradictions. So we resent being a lower caste, but also see ourselves as a distinct people, and to some degree wish to preserve that identity, and the notion of sort of African Americanness as a distinct subset of people in the world. What I would say there was beware of in sort of the caste analogy is where caste is seen as this unchanging thing. I don't know if it's true or not in India. In the United States, race changes a lot, in terms of what is a race, what is the meaning of blackness or whiteness, how blacks and whites relate to each other. It's not the sense that, you know, this was fixed in stone in 1619 and everything's been the same since. You know? In fact, there's been profound change over the last 100 years, certainly since the civil rights era. Yeah. So I think we should also be aware of change in our understanding of race too, and not just do everything as a woeful tragedy. You know, there have been great successes and improvements as well. Yeah.
Yes, there was a line in the book that stuck out to me. Ms. Wilkerson writes, caste is fixed and rigid, race is fluid and superficial, subject to the periodic redefinition to meet the needs of the dominant caste. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Well, one thing you can say, of course, is the shifting notion of whiteness, which he talks about quite a bit in the book. Is who counts as white in America? You go back to, she quoted Benjamin Franklin, you know, talking about sort of immigrants. He thought largely white meant people of British Protestant descent and maybe Germans, you know? But other sorts of European immigrants didn't seem to be quite white then. There's a whole literature in about the 19th century about when do the Irish become white? You know? In fact, there's a book called How the Irish Became White. And it was contested for a while. Are the Irish really white people? Or if they're not black, are they fully white? Are they in other category? And we have those categories today. Think of Latinos or Latinx people, you know, who are they white? I mean, some of them are as European as anyone in this room is, you know. Others are clearly of heavily African descended. Some are Amerindian. They're a multiracial group, you know. But so how do you sort of fix them in the black-white dichotomy version of racial hierarchy? So over time, white ethnics and immigrants become white, but it's a process. It takes time. They're not always fully accepted as white when they first come here. In fact, I remember growing up in Queens. I grew up in New York City in the 1970s. Whites I knew, friends, you know, would talk about different immigrants and about them, so whether they were white or not. Like I had one friend who said, well, I think Cubans are white like an Italian, you know, but he was less sure about Colombians. Well, and he was a Greek. So again, it's like, it seems like often the newest arrivals just get this type of whiteness, often are jealous of protecting it and sort of, you know, being gatekeepers. They're trying whether these other immigrants should be thought of as white or not. Yeah. So one thing is what whiteness means. Being in the dominant caste changes over time. And I think in the future, what we'll see is what are they going to do about people who are of mixed race or people who become successful? Like to get to that question, what's going to happen in 2040? I don't think it's going to be that profound a change. I think as either white nationalists fear or multicultural activists hope for, I think the notion that all non-whites will gang up against whites is probably fanciful. They're rivals of each other, as well as all the sort of the unwhite groups have a history of conflict with each other. Yeah, so it isn't like they're a harmonious whole. And also, whiteness can be expanded. The dominant caste can include people of mixed race. Yeah, it can include, you can whiten people who are minorities and become highly successful, like you do in Latin America, where if you're Pele, you know, even though you're black, in appearance, you get treated as sort of an honorary white because you were very successful. I mean, that sort of thing could happen too. Become more like Latin America, yeah? Where the notion of the dominant caste, it expands somewhat and isn't based exclusively on pure European appearance. We shouldn't presume that the one drop rule is going to last forever, and that could fall. And it'll be like, we'll determine whiteness based on people's success. Are they close to white? You know, things of that sort. You know, so my prediction is things aren't going to change that much in a majority-minority society. Whites will still be the single largest group in the country, the single richest group, and the single most powerful group. Yeah. So I think they still be the dominant power, even if they're 45% of the population, as opposed to 70%. So I think the fears of white nationalists that they're going to lose all are exaggerated. And I think the hopes of others that somehow we will take power because people of color are a majority. I think it'll not be that way. Brazil's not that way. and people of color are a majority in Brazil. Cuba's not that way. I went to Cuba a couple of years ago, and despite whatever propaganda they tell you, Cuba is people in charge are white. In Cuba, Black people are bottom of the social hierarchy. Even though as a Black American from a left-wing family, I was raised to believe that they did not have racism in Cuba. Yeah. But once you go there, you say, oh, it's racial hierarchy. Yeah. So I think even in countries where more people are where the majority of them are colored, by our definition, you find that whites still tend to be are still the dominant group. Yeah? So and that what they call white in Cuba and Brazil is more expansive than what they would call white here. So people who are sort of lightly, darker but light-skinned get categorized as white. Derek Jeter could be white in Cuba or Brazil. That sort of situation. Yeah.
So as we think about 2042 and that projection being that whites will not be the majority anymore, are you saying that we will be more flexible with how we include who is white based more on class?
Based on a number of things, in part of that, I think that may happen. I think it's one way to keep the majority. Of course, it's like, remember, she uses the term dominant caste a lot. So the dominant caste could be people who are white and near white. Yeah. And near white could be based on appearance. It could be based on affluence. Based on status. So that could happen. And my point was, if you go to Latin America, that's how they do sort of dominant status too. Is they expand the notion of whiteness beyond sort of the one drop rule. Because the people who are lighter skinned, the people of high status, they sort of give them a sort of honorary white status. That could happen here. Yeah. I don't think we're so different from Brazil or Cuba as we think. Yeah. That's one thing. And also, whites are still going to be the largest group in the country. They're still going to be the richest group. They're still going to be the most powerful group. So whites will still be in power, I think, after 2040. They're not going to be overthrown or anything like that. Yeah.
You mentioned the one drop rule. And one thing that I did not know as I read the book was that America was the blueprint for Nazi Germany, and that some of our rules, like the one drop rule, were too harsh for Hitler and the Third Reich.
Yes, I mean, that is something that I'm glad she brought up, because it's true. That indeed, they look to American sort of race laws on miscegenation, on Jim Crow, on how to deal with their Jewish problem as a model for how to do that. And as you said, without attracting international opprobrium. Because remember, the US's image is that it's a guardian of democracy. It's a model society, but yet it has this. Other countries in the world look to us too. In Latin America, in Central America, the 19-teens, they had a movement towards wanting to encourage white immigration into like Panama or Costa Rica, places like to encourage, the whitening of the population, or the mulatto and mestizo population. The mestizo population saw itself as distinct from, say, Jamaican laborers who were moving to places like Panama to work on plantations. And they also looked to Jim Crow laws as a way to deal with race there, where race to them meant largely mestizos, people of mixed white and Indian heritage, versus people either Black African descended or mixed Black and white descendant. So people around the world have different ways to categorize race, but yet have racial hierarchies. Remember, the Hutu and the Tutsi in Rwanda, have been fighting a genocide war for a long time. They're all Black people to us, but they see themselves as different races. Yeah. So other people around the world have their own ways of dividing race and arguing and fighting about it, arguing about it, and being inhumane to each other about it. Yeah. So I think these things are deeply part of the human condition. Yeah. And can take many different forms. Ours isn't the norm or the only way it can be done.
Yeah. One of the things that we started this conversation with is understanding historical context and understanding the truth of American history. I went to Berlin before COVID, obviously, and was so moved by the reckoning that at least on the outside, I don't know the ins and outs, but at least on the outside, that the city and the country is making to come to terms with the truth of their history. So when I think about, you know, what my children are learning and have learned, I have already products of CMS, and he's graduated. I am certain that he has not learned so much of this, and we're doing our best to inform our family. But as an educator, what would you like to see about our schools, our school system change in order to serve our students better and what they've learned and will learn?
Well, I do not have children, so I don't have the personal experience of having children in public schools. But I take it from what you've said is that CMS largely avoid sort of the issues of like slavery, Jim Crow, things like that? Do they sort of skimp over it?
So we have 4 children, and I don't think that I've ever really heard my children's intellectually discuss something like slavery or Jim Crow or systemic racism based on what they have learned at school. The conversation is much more about what they learn in our house and with our friends and our family. It's very sugar-coated, like, oh, we did some bad things a long time ago, but then we had the civil rights movement, and now everyone is equal and everyone has the same opportunities. So what's the problem?
Yeah, to the extent that it's a triumphalist narrative, it needs to be sort of corrected. I mean, one of the tensions you have in teaching public history in the school is, of course, part of what it is, it's civic education. You want people to sort of respect the country and its history and be good citizens, but you also don't want to have sort of this too much of triumphalism. We had difficulties in the past. We have now succeeded and transcended all of them. So I think you need a grappling with, you know, slavery, Jim Crow, its aftermath, what happened to Native Americans, you know, who, you know, suffered something that's nearly genocide. Yeah, those things have to be made part of the American story too. They're not the only story. I mean, I don't support the notion that history has to be endless trashing of America and how horrible it is. You know, I mean, we're a society like others with deep flaws and inhumanity. Every society in the world does that. Africans kill each other in droves. Yeah. So it isn't like when societies are monoracial, they don't commit atrocities against atrocities either, you know? But we need our atrocities to be exposed as part of the history as well as the positive things. So I think they have to be included, you know, in there. It's a tough balance, but it has to be made. But it needs to be a balance. I think you can't just, you also don't want to have a history of nothing but atrocity in atrocity to be American history. That would be an equal distortion. Yeah.
Yeah, that was one of my questions, and you beat me to it. But I do worry about not sharing, not celebrating what has gone well. And particularly when we think about the dominant caste and the subordinate caste, the stories of success and celebration and strength that especially our subcaste has experienced. And how do we balance telling those stories? Do you have any more thoughts on that?
Well, yes. I mean, I teach African American history. It's one of the things I do. So, yeah, I tend to also talk about people, achievement and accomplishments. What people did, what activists did, what writers and artists did. You know, what we did as a nation. I'm using the sense African Americans as a nation, like the Scots. It doesn't mean we have to separate from the United States. You know? But it means we are a distinct national group of our own. You know, when we meet Africans from whether South Africa or West Africa, you see that immediately. That although we're all Black people, so we share that commonality, but yet African Americans are a culture of their own. You know, in some degrees, a nation of our own. You know, in that sense. You know, with our own sort of like, you know, religious practices, variants of English, musical traditions, artistic traditions. So I think you have to teach those things too. The story of a people and what they achieve and accomplish, and not just have it be an atrocity story. Just, you know, we were victims and we suffered. it's not healthy for a people to have just a sense of themselves as those who suffer, you know? So you need to do both. And I've grown up as a Black person. I got plenty of Black history, not from school, mostly from parents and books. One thing is I found that books and things were widely accessible of Black history. Although I grew up in a big city in the 1970s, my parents went to college, my aunt was a civil rights leader, so I may have had more access than the average sort of, you know, poor average working class Black person. But those things are available. So, you know, you can buy them in our bookstore in town, as a matter of fact.
Yes,
Yeah.
you can.
So I think what you have to do also for education in general is don't just be satisfied with whatever the school does. You know, you have to also actively encourage learning. And I always encourage Black parents, you know, teach your children Black history. Don't just bemoan that CMS doesn't do it, you know? I remember everything from there being I read a graphic novel version of Frederick Douglass's slave narrative, and I was like 10 or something. We had that, or calendars that had figures in Black history, or children's books about it. This is in the 1970s. So these things exist. I would urge parents to go out and obtain them, but of course that's economically difficult for you. It's another challenge, but community organizations can make them better. If schools aren't doing the job, though, you know, the community has to step up and can. You could join, which I'm a member of, the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, which exists for that purpose, to popularize Black history. So I think, you know, if you don't know it, go out and seek it. So I'm saying, don't just say, well, the school didn't give it to me, therefore it's unavailable, I won't do it. Yeah. So
Absolutely.
use the many resources available online and through books and things now. So I think it's very find out about right now. Jeopardy contestants those white Jeopardy contestants always seem to answer all the questions on Black history accurately. So somebody's learning it somewhere. I just watched Jeopardy yesterday and noticed they all use it right away. So it's find out about. So go, you know, find out about it. Yeah.
Very good. I agree 100%. And not just on our African-American families to do it, but white families to do it as well. So one more question before we go to our breakout rooms. I hear you talking about a people and a people's stories, their series of stories. And one of the things that I am just struggling to wrap my brain around, and I don't know if it's just me, but Ms. Wilkerson writes about the fact that race is man-made, that we made it, we defined it, we set everyone in their spots according to what they look like, at least in the US. So how do we undo race, if we should, I don't know, and also acknowledge a people and celebrate who they are, what their color in this case has created for them, the set of experiences that they had to face?
Well, what I would say about that is, I mean, I guess she's making a variation of the argument that race is a cultural construction, a social construction. And I would argue social constructions are real. They are just as real as scientific construction. So I don't think that, you know, race is a thing that has to necessarily be abolished, you know? Or that because humans created it, that it has no salience or reality. I mean, as a lived experience, it does have salience and reality, yeah? So I don't think it necessarily needs to be abolished. I think the thing is, you shouldn't be punished because of it, or you shouldn't suffer because of it, or you shouldn't be ostracized because of it. It's not that, you know, your identity ceases to exist and no one should notice it. Yeah? It's, you know, just like, you know, you don't have to, you know, you can still be a Scot in the world and not suffer because of it. Yeah? And I think that's the thing to, you know, really seeking, is not to suffer because of Blackness. It's not that Blackness should, you know, cease to exist. People shouldn't notice it. Race or identity as will end, because I think as a social reality, Blackness is very real. And people who are Black, you know, have an attachment to it. They don't necessarily wish to relinquish it. They just wish not to suffer because of it. You know? not something you actually wish to relinquish. I don't think Isabel Wilkerson would relinquish it either. Yeah.
No, that's a beautiful, helpful answer. Thank you for that clarification. So, and thank you for everything that you shared with us.
Oh, sure.
That was so insightful and helpful to me as a reader, as a mother, as a community member, as a friend, and as what I hope to be a teacher in my own home and anywhere else that I can be as well. So thank you for that extra information and for being so generous with your time and expertise.
Oh, you're welcome.
So we are going to go to some breakout groups. Beth is helping to organize those. What we'd like for you to do with the friends that you're placed with is have a conversation about why you're here, what brought you here, and what you hope to get out of this series of conversations. So today's obviously, but we have 2 more as well. What do you want to get out of these conversations, and what do you want to give to these conversations is another way to look at it. So it's a great time to meet a few more neighbors, connect with people maybe you haven't seen in a while, and then we will come back together in about 15 minutes. So once you get all organized, you have about 15 minutes to connect with one another, and then we will come back together and answer a few of the questions that I saw were popping up in the chat as we were talking with you. So I hope you enjoyed your conversations. I hope they were a little gritty. I hope they were a little uncomfortable. I hope you maybe put your foot in your mouth, because that's what it feels like to do this work and to learn from it and to do better next time. So I have learnings from tonight that I'll be taking back and reflecting on as well. So thank you for giving me the chance to do this with you. All right, let's close out then with a couple of questions. Dan, we had one in the chat around expanding the definition of whiteness and how that would be done, whether it's economic, legislative, some other mechanism, demographic changes. I think it's a little bit hard for us to think about what that means, especially as we think about class and caste, and how we already have some examples of celebrities or athletes who maybe they can act it. I think that was the words from the book. So talk to us a little bit more about this expansion of whiteness.
By that I mean expansion of who gets sort of admitted or treated as they're in the dominant caste, even if they're not white in physical appearance. I think you're also being stuck on, well, you have to be white in physical appearance. And I was making the point, like in Latin America, you can not be white in physical appearance, but yet be treated as part of the dominant caste. What I was saying is it's going to be a social fact comes on the ground. It's not something I think that will happen through legislation. For example, with multiracial families and their children, what are you going to consider your grandchildren to be? Yeah. I think very often sort of white grandparents will think of their grandchildren, who are partially them, as being white, very closely white adjacent. They're part of your family. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So I think people like that, their sort of status, the way they're thought of in society will be different. For highly successful people, I mean, you are a minority. It's just my Tiger Woods example. Tiger Woods is known to all be black, but yet, I mean, he gets treated as being part of the dominant caste in some ways, like in his recent traffic accident, where, he doesn't get hauled off to jail. They don't do a whole lot of DUI testing and stuff like that. Yeah. So I think, one thing that she left out in this cast here was the notion of social class. Yeah. Class matters. Yeah. And I think also for highly successful minorities, will have the occasional annoyance of being a minority, but you're not George Floyd either. Yeah. So you have to also consider the notion of social class, which I think is a thing that hasn't come up yet in the 3 chapters. Class is very important in American society. It's a not talked about thing, yeah. Mm. But also, all black people aren't the same social class, so they're not all exactly the same and interchangeable for all things, or necessarily have the same experiences. I've never been stopped by a police officer in my whole life. Yeah, I have never been harassed by a policeman. Yeah, mm-hmm. My interactions have always been positive. Just he gave me the ticket or didn't, said just, you know, make sure you don't do that next time. And it was like that, you know? So, you know, don't assume uniform experiences either, or necessarily that the very worst thing you've read about was the average or the norm, you know? You know, I was to be a public defender. Most arrests are uneventful, you know? Some can end very badly, as we've seen on TV. Some can end with an unjustifiable death, but most are normal, you know? And nothing in particular happens, you know? So that's out of the norm, you know? So that's what I mean, is that, you know, when you put together race, class, caste, that I think the affluent, the successful, the lighter complexioned, those who were like your granddaughter, who otherwise sounds white, went to Davidson College, you know, stuff like that will be thought of differently than a Black person from poverty. Yeah.
Yeah, you remind me of.
I have some comment to make.
Go ahead.
This is John Wood. My name shows as Madeline. My wife took a Benny here for a minute. But my thought was that, you know, if I've traveled the world in my work, and I've been involved in a lot of detail of engineering people and what have you. And what I found out through the entire world, that the caste system really exists in every society. It's systemic. That's a part of it. And it doesn't matter if you're in England, where your caste is basically what school did you go to, or if, of course, India has its own caste system for sure. Also, I mean, caste can be either educational, can be economic, and it can even be physical features. I know that in northern part of Africa, there are some Africans that have a very Aryan type nose, and those that are in the more Congo area have a flattened nose, and they are very conscious about that, and the wars have been fought over that. But I've also witnessed where out in Australia, this one fellow who was a chief engineer of a company, he was very educated, very well spoken, but he was actually an Aborigine, been educated and come through it. And he was well thought of in the country and in that community. So, you know, it's just the caste system is here to stay. I don't know how you'll ever get rid of it. It's part of what people are, I believe.
Thank you,
You
Mr.
can
Wood, for that.
I would say that it's not an all or nothing proposition, that either society is entirely caste ridden or they're entirely egalitarian. I think we can make things much better for people. You know, things are much better now to be a Black person than it was in 1960. And if you want to test it, go read a Black newspaper from 1950 or 1960. See how awful people's everyday lives and what people have to say were. You know, but that doesn't. You know, it can get better. When better is good. Better is better than worse.
Well, I agree that things do get better.
There's going to be a time when inequality doesn't exist in societies.
Well, I would have to say this, that I think that we've shown the world that things do get better if you are in a positive economic situation. If you're in a non-positive economic situation, I think it's much more difficult. If you are in you know, democratic systems will get there quicker than will the non-democratic systems. So that's in my.
We have others. Kara?
It's not always solved in a family either. I've had students to come in and it's a mixed marriage. Father brought one in to register him for school and he was listed as one race. The mother brought the other one in a couple of years later. He was another race and they were in the same family. And we didn't discover this for a while. So the families haven't even agreed as to what race.
Yeah.
No, I think, you know, individual cases will find all sorts of variations. I'm wondering what the general social trend will be.
Yeah.
Over time. But I think in different families, it's going to be, you know, very different things will be fraught for people who weren't expecting this in their lives and know how to deal with it. Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I think I'm not saying family's a magic solution. I didn't mean to imply that. I'm saying that over time, it'll have an impact. Yeah.
One thing we can agree on, I think it's a complicated set of structures and systems that we did inherit, and that we do have the responsibility to do things better. And that's a choice that we can make. So one of the choices that I teach and the work that I do is around understanding unconscious bias and the programming that we have inherited, and that we pass down either intentionally or unintentionally with our behavior, our choices, how we include, how we exclude, how we spend our money, where we go, who we talk to. So Dan, to help us close out this conversation with a little bit of hope, I think that's one thing we cannot give up. A little bit of hope is, how can we be better at deprogramming what we have inherited?
Well, it's hard for me, of course, because I'm not white, for one thing. So I don't have the internal experience of you know, what that means to me as my possession. Nonetheless, I think an important thing is a way, it's not to, again, denigrate or deny your European heritage, but also to really work on just in your daily life of things like get to know people of color as like on a personal basis, not just as someone who's an expert on race relations to ask questions of, or something like that, or don't just say, well, I've read Ta-Nehisi Coates, so I know everything, you know? But, you know, go make friends with the person. Get to see their interests, see them as an individual, you know? I mean, that's not, it's a start. We're just getting to learn and interact with people. Like I say, break out of the habit of, if everybody I know, especially is white, you know, you're going to have to break out of that and get to, you know, to help make racial problems better. It's just knowing people, you know, interacting with people as friends and colleagues, you know, also not as representatives of their identity either, you know, or as experts to tell you the answer. They may not know either, you know. But I think that would be a good place to start, yeah, as any.
Thank you. Yeah, it's really hard, I think, to either intentionally hate or unintentionally hate or misunderstand or make assumptions when you know someone, when you know their heart, when you know their family, and when you know what's meaningful to them. It makes it a lot more difficult to walk through the world without your eyes open. So I think that's good advice too. I think there's a lot more to it. I think one of the things that, as a white person, I'm a white person, I have the responsibility to do is to have hard conversations, to put myself and the people that I care about into conversations where we're unpacking this programming, where we're challenging the status quo. And I can tell you from personal experiences that those conversations haven't always gone well. And they have created divisiveness within my family. I'm not proud of that. I'm not saying go out and break your family up, but I am saying have the courage to bring ideas, to bring heartfelt, good intentions to a conversation that maybe you haven't had before about race, about caste, about community. One of the things that clicked to me when you were talking, Dan, is that I fell in love with a boy who was African American when I was in middle school, and it was not allowed. It was not allowed in my house. It was terrible. I was not in a good place with my family, and I was 15. I fell in love with an African American professional football player, and he was accepted into my family in a much different way.
What do you think the difference was? Because he was a football player?
His identity was more white. He was wealthy and he was popular and he was on the news, and the other one wasn't going to have that experience. But the definition of his whiteness was expanded and he was included in my family. So I had not thought of it like that before until you helped me see that. So I thank you for that, because that's also a conversation that I can have with my family that's different than what we've had before. So I appreciate that. All right, one more just not piece of advice, I can't give you any advice, but what I can say is that without hope, without empathy, we don't change. We get stuck in accepting in what has always been. And I know this town and these citizens better than that. So I know that that's not the case for us. So thank you for being here and for being vulnerable, for being courageous, and don't stop here. Anything that you want to share with us, please do in the chat or privately or at Main Street Books, and we'll hand it back over to Ada to close us out. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much. Thank you, Tara. Thank you, Dan. We are looking forward to keeping these conversations going. We've got 2 more conversations about the middle and end of Caste. And I think we've learned a lot from this virtual experience that we can take with us into the March 16th, Tuesday, March 16th evening. Thoughts, I think I have this sense that I just want to, I wanted to talk more, not that or listen more in my breakout room. And I think maybe some of us also some of you feel that way too. So I recognize that we're just like at the tippy top of the iceberg here. So I appreciate your patience with that, but I think we can make some accommodations in our next meeting. So please, if you haven't registered for the second conversation, it's March 16th, and you can find registration on the Town of Davidson's Read Davidson page or at Main Street Books, our event calendar. I also wanted to point out some of the things that came up in this conversation are topics, themes, issues that are addressed in the other books that we've chosen for Read Davidson, which I haven't mentioned, but we wanted to make Read Davidson inclusive of more aged readers. So we chose 3 other books for younger readers that are actually excellent reads for all ages. Legendborn by Tracy Dion. Tracy will be in conversation with Dr. Hillary Green, who is here at the college for the year. That's a YA fantasy. So for YA as young adult, that's set at Chapel Hill and looks at all sorts of like history of the campus, but is also fantastical and involves magic. Alicia Williams is a Charlotte author who's written a book for middle grades readers called Genesis Begins Again. And one of the main themes that the main character wrestles with in that, and so middle grades is like ages 8 to 12, is colorism within her family and community. So she's an African-American kid whose experience is different because her skin, the shade of her skin is different than other members of her family. And that's obviously come up in this conversation as well. Alicia will be in conversation with a Davidson K-8 teacher, Robin McLennan, in April. And then we've got a picture book called The Power of One by Trudy Ludwig, and we'll host her virtually in April as well. So again, I hope that we're all coming back for this extensive programming that we've put together so that really this is a kickoff for lots of conversations that continue to happen. And we couldn't be more pleased with the turnout. We appreciate you being here, because that's a lot of it, right, is showing up. And again, thanks so much. If you have any last thoughts, feel free to put them in the chat, or you can also email us at mainstreetbooksdav@gmail.com if you've just got something you want to more privately share.
Great.
Thanks so much. Have a wonderful evening.